I'm John Gregory Long, and I'm a writing, rhetoric, and technical communication major here at JMU. I'm creating this video essay primarily for a course project for WRTC 200, but I've been interested in making content on this subject matter for a very long time. Today we're going to be talking about government, specifically why I think government could be, if it isn't already, an obsolete technology. Moreover, I'm here to challenge the commonly held belief that government is a necessary part of human civilization. The end goal of this essay is less so to spark an anarchist revolution, as fun as that may sound, but more so to get as many people as possible who end up watching this to maybe be more open about questioning the things that they've been taught, and through that, maybe live their lives a little more free from our social conditioning. To start off, I feel as though I should do what I've always been taught to do whilst setting up an argument for a thesis, and that's to define my terms. The problem is, defining my terms, specifically the vaguest, government, proved to be a lot more difficult than I'd anticipated. So I decided to bring in someone who's a lot more educated in poli-sci than myself, and that's my own brother. His name's Wesley Long, and he's about to graduate from James Madison University with a degree in international politics. When I asked him to define government, this is what he had to say.
I would define government along the same lines as Max Weber, who's a German sociologist, political thinker. His definition is commonly cited, and I think it's pretty accurate. He looks at government as a monopoly on the legitimate use of force or violence within a given territory. He says that the state is a human community that successfully claims the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence within a territory. And I think this is important in that it sort of demystifies government and it reduces it to its basic essence. All it is a group of people who exert control through violence or threat or implied use of violence. If you resist the state, for example, it doesn't end well for you in most cases. If they want to tax you and you don't pay your taxes, you go to jail. If you resist going to jail, they can use violence to coerce you. He also points out that this hasn't always been the case throughout history, and we'll get into that more later, but older systems like feudalism, for example, it wasn't exactly clear that the state had a clear monopoly on violence.
Okay, so before I let him keep going, I want to reiterate the definition that he's just given us. So he said that a human community that successfully claims the monopoly on the legitimate use of force in a territory is, what government is. And I think that's a really great definition because it's broad enough to encompass everything that government has been, and also vague enough to encompass everything that government could be. So now that you've understood that, you're probably wondering how I could think that government, such that it is, could ever cease to exist in the modern world. And that's a fair question, no doubt. But before we get into it, we should really move backwards. So you've probably heard the trope that history repeats itself, and I think that's true. But a lot can be learned by looking at the trajectory of history's movement, and then extrapolating and theorizing on where that trajectory of history is going to take us moving forward. So I asked my brother, I said, explain to me a little bit about where government came from and how it turned into what we see functioning today.
Okay, so to get into the history of the development of what we think of as modern government, we're going to start kind of in the mid-1600s, and I'll state from the outset that I recognize that this is an extremely Eurocentric view, but I would argue that since Europe, the European model was exported throughout the world through imperialism and then even through globalization, that's become kind of the world model. So we're going to look at cases like England, which was hugely influential in the development of the United States, and we're going to look at continental Europe. And basically, the idea of the state as we see it today wasn't always a foregone conclusion. Prior to the Peace of Westphalia, which was this pivotal moment where the idea of the state as we see it today came into being. Right prior to this, there was a conflict called the 30 Years' War that took place in the mid-1600s. Now, this conflict was particularly brutal, and it was a religious conflict primarily. There were different factions and sort of proto-states that had different alliances with each other, but really the primary motivation was on religious lines. It was Catholics versus Protestants. This was right after the Protestant Reformation. And the Catholic Church, for centuries, had essentially a monopoly on Europe. Europe wasn't seen as primarily a community of states. It was seen as Christendom, this idea that the church was really sovereign above everything. The Pope was the highest political authority as well as religious authority, and that states were kind of a secondary consideration. The 30 Years' War basically changed that. The 30 Years' War, with the Protestant Reformation, it challenged the established order of religious hierarchy in order in Europe, and it broke everyone into sides of Catholics versus Protestants, and the war was so brutal and so bloody that by the end, the treaty that resulted, the Treaty of Westphalia, which we refer to as the foundation of the Westphalian system, which I would argue is still somewhat in effect today, is this idea that states are the preeminent actors in world politics. And our idea of government is based on this idea that states have the primary responsibility for the welfare of their citizens within a specific geographical area. That norm holds all the way up to this day. There's, even with the United Nations, there's a recognition in international law today that it's not acceptable for one state to interfere in the internal affairs of another state, and that can trace back to Westphalia.
So he starts not necessarily at the actual inception point of a monopoly of force, like we've been talking about, but rather begins the timeline at the first real instances of what we could call modern government. And ultimately, I think it's important to recognize how recent in human history that was. Everything he's talking about took place hardly 400 years ago. When we hear him talk about these concepts like the inception of secularized independent governmental systems, it raises the question of not only how did that spread to the rest of the world, but how did it further develop into what we see operating in the world today? Now, one way in my interview with Wesley that I think he explains this very well is through a little bit of English history.
This piece of Westphalia was extremely influential in molding our view of government in continental Europe. If you look at England, England was always kind of separate from Europe. And the English tradition of common law was hugely influential in the United States and how our government is developed. And you can look at how England in this early pre-modern period in the 1600s was shifting from a society of monarchy, of feudalism, to a society based on law and on precedent and common law. And so you have several crucial events. You have the English Civil War, which was happening right around the same time as the 30 Years' War in Europe, where essentially the English king is killed, he's executed, completely destroys the illusion that the king is this ultimate untouchable figure. It shatters the illusion that government is something that's natural and sort of God-ordained and inevitable, and it reveals that government is essentially just the people. Government is representatives of the people, like the parliament, for example. And so...
Now, I'm really happy for you, and I'm going to let you finish, but I think this is hugely important. I'll break it down for you what I mean a little bit more later, but the narrative that I, and I think Wesley in this clip alike, are wanting you to pick up on is the linear movement from where single figureheads are in power, are either being dethroned, or a consensus of recognition that their power is limited and ultimately exists to establish a system where people are controlling, protecting, and securing the interests of their people. And most importantly, that the temple veil is being drawn back to reveal that the relation of state to mankind is more accurately the relation of men to mankind.
Even after Cromwell, he ends up being ousted and they bring back the monarchy, the legacy remains. The legacy that the parliament is the supreme power and not the king. And that's crucial because it represents the people. And then you have in the 1680s that further develops when you have William of Orange becomes the new monarch of England via a coup. They call it the Glorious or the Bloodless Revolution in the 1680s, where they take out the Stuart king and they put in this Dutch prince. And in exchange for that, you have this Bill of Rights that is the foundation for the Bill of Rights in the US. And there's a lot of crucial checks on government power that are listed in there. And it's still part of the British Constitution to this day.
So by now you should start to see the picture I, with the help of someone who knows a little more about what they're talking about, is trying to lay out for you. And that's something akin to the antithesis of the consolidation of power, whereby authority in the state as a concept is becoming increasingly abstract and decentralized. A huge part of this movement is the widespread adoption of the law as the ultimate authority. even over government officials in modern nations.
Moving along in the development of government, um, ever since you have the English Bill of Rights, you have the American Revolution, you have the French Revolution, there's an idea of moving away even from the idea of, so, first you have Westphalian sovereignty. We remove the church as the primary organizing factor. But moving beyond that, we even are reducing the role of an absolute monarch or of an absolute ruler of a nation state. We're devolving power even further to the people themselves. And we see that with the American Revolution, we see that with the French Revolution. And we see the concept of law and of intangible concepts becoming the primary center of government, right? And I would argue that that's the case in most developed and even non-Western countries today. Most countries, with few exceptions, have, at least in theory, a law that is the highest authority in the land. So in the United States, the Constitution is the highest authority in the land, higher than any person, president, legislature, et cetera, et cetera. Even in countries where you have nominally a monarch, in most cases it's functionally a constitution. Law is essentially seen, at least in the American tradition and somewhat in the British tradition, as a limit on the power of the sovereign, and as something that you have a king, a monarch, a president, whatever. The law is something that places limits on that. It doesn't empower that person, it limits them.
We've done a pretty good job of outlining where this concept of state or government comes from, and the narrative of development it's followed thus far. But before I go so far as to say that it's irrelevant, or to stick with my terms, obsolete, we need to figure out what exactly it does and if those things need to continue to be done either by the state or even at all.
We can also view government sort of reflectively, looking back at it as, what did it do functionally? What does government accomplish? And there's sort of there are multiple perspectives on this. You can look at government as a means of economic allocation, and certain people have done this. They've looked at government primarily in economic terms. Government, there's people who say government is the entity which decides who gets what and when and how much. The assumption being government is in charge of distributing resources. You can look at like the Marxist narrative, for example. In Marxism, government is viewed as the means by which the rich secure their own property. It's the means by which, once certain bourgeois class have accumulated capital and wealth, they have their factories and they have everyone sort of subservient working for them. Government is that institution by which they subjugate everyone else. They ensure that property is only theirs.
Let's take this view of government as the means by which capital is managed and investigate it further. Marx had a really negative view on capitalism, and he thought it was, with the aid of government, furthering the class struggle that Marx himself so boldly claims is the narrative of all human history. Now, communism, as was laid out by Marx, never really came to fruition, and to this day has never actually been attempted. Similarly, a true capitalist society has never fully been in existence either. That being said, a lot can be learned from when both of these systems have been tried to varying degrees, and in various political systems over the course of history. I think when we look at the attempts made to create communist societies, they all end in failure, and I believe that failure stems from their inability to fully control people. On the flip side, states which have been capitalistic from their inception, such as the United States, as well as states which have adopted capitalistic models more recently, such as modern Russia, a former communist state, have found great success with this economic system. This, of course, is good news for the aspiring anarchist, as capitalism inherently is unregulated. Obviously, that is not purely the case anywhere yet, but the point is that history has shown that government is not needed to regulate capital. Of course, that's not all that a government does. Wesley goes on to explain another angle here.
You can look at a more libertarian perspective. Frederick Bastiat, the French philosopher in the mid-19th century, he talked about government as being simply a collectivization of a natural right of self-defense. So he talks about each person has a natural right to defend themselves. If someone attacks you, tries to kill you, or to take your property, you have a natural right to defend yourself. He argues that government is simply an extension of this idea. It's the idea that we're going to collectivize and have a collective right of self-defense. So if one person tries to steal from another person, tries to kill another person, the government acts to defend that person from aggression, essentially.
Here's where people usually have the most problems tracking with the idea that government may become obsolete, and that is in their own protection. After all, it seems as though the only reason we have our way of life as it is today in the United States is because of the United States government watching over us. I want to bring this back to the previous point of capitalism because it's extremely important here. We live in an increasingly global market, one where almost all nations rely on all other nations for their economic stability. That is because, with the advent of the internet and an increasingly cheap and fast travel and trade, we're really dealing with a global marketplace as opposed to individual economies that function mostly autonomously, as it has been for most of human history. People often say, well, without government and a standing army, what's to stop, let's say, China from marching in and taking everything that we have? And perhaps this was a legitimate fear, and rightfully so for most of human history, but the truth is that simply will not happen. There's a great quote from the book The Lexus and the Olive Tree, which was written in 1999 and outlines the concept of globalization, which says, quote, "No two countries that both had McDonald's had fought a war against each other since each got its McDonald's," end quote. With the exception of some political coups, revolutions, and questionably militaristic police actions, this is held remarkably true since it was written nearly 2 decades ago. The concept is almost bordering on comedy in its simplicity, and for that reason it's remarkably easy to understand. It is plainly not in the best interest of any one nation who is a part of the global economy to wage war against another, because ultimately it would do more good to maintain trade with that nation than to attack it. To extrapolate this idea, in theory, we would not need armies in a fully globalized and capitalistic world. To begin to wrap this up, I want to reiterate the reason for the creation of this video essay, and that is to call people to question the notions that they have taken for granted, and to expand upon that our world is not only evolving, but it has been doing so faster and more drastically than ever. My final question to my brother was, how does he predict where government as a system will go from here? Alas, his 8-minute long answer essentially explained why he hasn't a clue, or moreover, why no one really can have a clue. So instead, I rephrased it more broadly and asked him, does he think government will stay the same or continue to undergo changes as it has? And his answer was pretty profound.
I would definitely question or challenge the notion that government is inevitable and that it will always be the same. I think if you look at history, that's just not true. It is true if you look at the past about 400 years, largely the way we've organized society. That doesn't necessarily mean that's how we have to organize society going forward.
In the end, that's what I want to give to people, the perspective to see that things never really stay the same. Another crucially important piece to why I believe government could become obsolete is due to the concept of singularity. This has become a buzzword that you've probably heard of before, but it stems from the writings of John von Neumann, who accurately predicted in the early 1990s that technology would not only continue to advance, but that it would do so at an ever-increasing rate, which it has. I think that technology is a huge driving factor in the increasing irrelevance of government.
You could argue that globalization, you could argue that trade and the internet and social media, people being able to communicate in large capacities on unprecedented levels between countries. People today can communicate with people in other countries with almost no restrictions. This is not something that's always been the case. If you look even at the early 20th century, governments controlled communication in a lot of cases. If you look at World War I, people in America were convinced that everyone that was in Germany were these Huns and these sort of evil people out to get us, out to sink our submarines. World War II, similar thing. Like, governments control narratives. They control historically how people view other people. If you look at propaganda during wartime, even during the Cold War, this is true. Definitely more information became available during the Cold War, but at the same time, you had maybe 1 or 2 or 3 TV channels, and that was about it. They got their licenses from the government. Government controlled all the narratives. So you could argue that with the rise of the internet, with the rise of sort of a democratization of news, of communication, of how we share information, it's not controlled by the government. And so how governments can no longer shape how their citizens view citizens of other countries. And this is just one way that government kind of authority is being usurped almost. And I don't mean that word sort of negatively. I mean that, like, their power is just sort of being naturally eroded. It's withering away kind of under the new information economy. And so I see no reason why we have to, or why it should be a foregone conclusion that governments will exist like they have indefinitely. I could definitely see that we might reorganize how we look at governments. We might have a more democratized approach where not as much power rests directly in centralized positions of authority like nation states, and it might become more decentralized where people have more individual choice or individual authority. I don't want to make any predictions, but I think looking at history here, we can see that sort of this Westphalian system, it's been predominant for the past 400 years, but it was not necessarily before that. And there were other ways that societies were organized. And so there's no reason to believe that we have to organize society the way we do now indefinitely.
Mankind is an amazing thing, and we have developed a very specific system of organizing people into regions and placing those people under the authority of those in charge of those regions. But I hope that through watching this, you can begin to see a larger picture of what government has been to humanity, and more importantly, the limitless potential that we have to grow out of the systems and technologies that we once relied upon in the past. There may come a day, if it hasn't passed already, that government becomes, like many things before it, a relic of the past, an obsolete technology. And I hope that people can be as optimistic of the possibilities the future brings as I am.